We had the topic human rights, and we studied the countries
Syria, Democratic Republic of Congo,
North Korea,
the Gambia,
Sudan,
Iraq,
Saudi Arabia,
and Egypt.
To improve the democracy in these countries and install a system of checks and balances,
To create stricter civil rights laws.
To impose economic sanctions.
to create new management positions and crisis storage centers for refugee camps.
To begin with, a huge issue going on in many countries is government control. In countries such as the Gambia and Saudi Arabia, the government has total power and has limited its people's rights to voice their opinions and fight for their rights. Both governments abuse their power and often use their status as a way to find loopholes in laws. This is incredibly unfair to the people, and they need for their voices to be heard. In order to combat this problem, the UN should introduce a strong democracy with a separation of powers. This way, the people would be able to participate in matters of the country, and there would be a system of checks and balances ensuring that all power would not be in the hands of one person or a certain group of people. The 2016 presidential election was a huge turning point for the Gambia. The Gambia is infamous for its restrictions of freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. However, ever since May 2016, when the campaigns for the election began, situations have grown worse. Those who oppose the leading political party held a peaceful protest.
Vital on a peaceful demonstration. Nimme yen soto jeto Gambia le jareta nyala. Nat mbed mbali ya marla malla fi nimbitala malla moy nendir kuma faaf dala. Malla moy kuma fa dala me alon kam ko kuma kurun namo.
The government did not agree with this and arrested those who opposed them. Many of those who were arrested died shortly after in prison, raising suspicion that the government mistreated them. Not only has the government physically taken control, but it has also created laws that prevent people from expressing their opinions online and on other forms of media. A recent article by Amnesty International highlights 3 ways that Saudi government has abused its power. According to the article, defenders of human rights in Saudi Arabia have been imprisoned. Those who haven't have fled the country in fear of mistreatment for the government. Along with this, the country has disbanded associations that threaten the government. Lastly, Saudi Arabia has been executing people at an alarming rate. Since November 2013, 350 people have been executed. This article supports the obvious fact that Saudi Arabia needs a stronger democracy. In conclusion, the government systems in both the Gambia and Saudi Arabia have proven themselves to not be sufficient for the countries. It is crucial that the UN steps in and helps organize these governments like it has in over 100 countries. These elections would allow the countries to build from the bottom up and improve their situations drastically. The UN will be giving the people the best chance they have at getting a good life. The previous elections and governments that the UN has helped out with have proven to be successful, and I strongly believe that this will be the case for the Gambia and Saudi Arabia.
My solution is to create stricter civil rights laws. Many governments around the world are carrying on unrestricted. In other words, they can do whatever they want when it comes to their citizens. People living in countries like Syria and Egypt are suffering at the hands of their governments, so they need stricter laws that will protect them rather than work against them. Many people don't express their personal political opinions in these countries for fear of being incarcerated or physically harmed.
The Sisi administration has made very clear how it deals with political opponents. It arrests them, tries them in trials that lack fair standard procedures, detains and abuses them at Scorpion Prison, and largely cuts them off from the outside world.
More strict civil rights laws would ensure that people wouldn't fear the government that is supposed to be supporting them. According to Amnesty International, in some cases, the government would go to extreme measures for silence, especially when other politicians have opposing opinions to their government. This practice is something that needs to be dealt with immediately. Issues such as enforced disappearances and extreme interrogation techniques are commonplace in such governments, and it is not hard to be intimidated by this. Some countries have even put into place laws that limit organizations which peacefully protest. This restricts freedom of speech, which should be one of the most basic human rights. According to the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, if there is no mutual trust between a government and its people, it can only have a negative influence on both. Citizens in countries that have laws that restrict this behavior, like the U.S., tend to trust in their law enforcement much more. In countries like Syria, which are going through times of civil war, innocent people need laws that will protect them from these horrors. Furthermore, these laws will bring some much-needed stability to the lives of these people. For instance, children's educations are being interrupted for reasons that are completely out of their control. Not to mention that living in a war zone can have awful psychological effects that last a lifetime. More strict civil rights laws will make certain countries better places to live, since their sole purpose is to improve quality of life.
Over the course of this unit, I focused on the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan. I found that the Sudanese and Congolese government have absolute power. They commit serious crimes against their people, ignore their constitutions, and neglect their citizens' well-being and rights. In Sudan, there is a huge child soldier and rebel group crisis. The government is doing nothing to protect their citizens, and every day children are being stolen from their homes. Villages are being bombed by the government, and armed conflicts are breaking out daily. And the government is killing hundreds in their attempts to end rebel causes. In the Congo, the president pushed back the elections that would see him out of office for 2 whole years.
On October 19th, we gave him the first yellow card. And then in November 19th, we gave him the second yellow card. And December 19th is this, the red card.
Kabila will remain in office until a new president is elected. Nothing will happen. If somebody will try to disturb the security in this town, he will meet police forces as everywhere in the world.
They killed 53 of their citizens who were doing a peaceful protest against the delay of elections. The list of offenses for both countries goes on and on. I know that the UN already had an intervention with the Congo, but as I'm sure you know, President Kabila made many false promises and made no changes to his administration. I think it's time that the UN steps in Sudan as well. I think that a possible solution for countries that abuse their power is economic sanctions. A government should be a unifying force that protects their citizens and their rights, but in countries like Sudan and the Congo, they do the opposite. Economic sanctions put a stress on the government and their sources. Many of the countries that would have sanctions placed on them rely heavily on the resources of other nations. This stress forces their countries to step back and evaluate exactly why the UN placed these sanctions. More often than not, it's because their citizens are being oppressed and their rights are being violated. The UN found sanctions to be successful in many instances. For example, as stated from the Journal of University of Central Arkansas, in 1993, many Western countries imposed economic sanctions on Malawi to try and improve their human rights. The Malawian government had a referendum, elected new officials, and installed a two-party system. The UN lifted the sanctions when the changes were written into the constitution. However, as you know, economic sanctions aren't working quite as well in the Congo. When President Joseph Kabila pushed back the elections, there were already sanctions present in the Congo. As stated in The Guardian, your next approach targeted what Kabila obviously cared about more than his country, which is friends and his wealth. I think it was an excellent move limiting his sources and his friends, but it doesn't seem to be stopping Kabila in his oppression of his people. I propose that you wait to see if the situation changes at all in the Congo, and if not, to then threaten to remove the Congo from the seat in the UN. This would limit them extremely and could very well be the thing to make Kabila cooperate. So in summary, my solution is to impose economic sanctions, and in case that doesn't work, let said nation know that their seat in the UN is in jeopardy.
The largest refugee crisis of our lifetime is occurring right now because of refugees fleeing ISIS from countries like Syria. As illustrated in this graph from the Mercy Corps, the number of Syrian refugees increased from 1,250 in 2011 to 3.8 million at the beginning of 2015, and it has only increased since then. These refugees are overstuffed into refugee camps that are created haphazardly in the countries surrounding Syria and are subjected to horrible conditions. Check out this video clip describing the refugee crisis from Khor-Zayat in a nutshell.
A third of the Syrian people have been displaced within Syria, while over 4 million have fled the country. The vast majority of them reside now in camps in the neighboring countries, who are taking care of 95% of the refugees, while the Arab states of the Persian Gulf together have accepted 0 Syrian refugees, which has been called especially shameful by Amnesty International. The UN and the World Food Programme were not prepared for a refugee crisis on this scale. As a result, many refugee camps are crowded and undersupplied, subjecting people to cold, hunger and disease.
This is not the worst of it. According to an article published by Newsweek, child refugees are being recruited to become child soldiers in the fight against ISIS in Mosul. People in these camps are left without food, clean water, education, everyday necessities, and most importantly, the freedom to move where they wish to move. The United Nations has created the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which is created to supply food and aid to these camps, as well as set forth a set of guidelines for camp planning to prevent situations like the ones occurring in the Middle Eastern countries surrounding Syria. These guidelines are meant to keep people living in the camps with safe environments to recoup before moving on and assimilating into a new country. However, even with these guidelines, camps are not functioning the way that they should. According to an article published by the New York Times, UN aides at refugee camps often only hinder the camp because they come from all over the world and don't know what the aid before them did. Therefore, instead of sending out several liaisons per year, the UNHCR should only send out one liaison per year to work closely with the country of the camp and enforce UN regulations. This will help the UN work much more closely with the country and will help to provide better living conditions for the people. When these liaisons are switched out, there should be a training period for the new liaison to understand how to continue in the same vein as the last one. Furthermore, the UNHCR should also elect a committee to work closely with the countries that are involved or will soon become involved in taking in refugees, as they need to learn how to help these refugees prosper. Finally, the UNHCR should work on compiling an emergency refugee crisis storage unit, as the refugee situation will only become worse, and the UN was severely unprepared for the amount of the need of the refugees. If the UN can work to create structural units such as the utilitarian and uniform containers at the Kilis refugee camp in Turkey, often called the best refugee camp in the world, then they can compile them and distribute them to countries in need of more regulated refugee camps. And this would drastically increase the state of living in these refugee camps. These solutions would require an increase of the budget of the UNHCR, which is the only logical solution to the influx of refugees in our world. The United Nations should consider these reforms to transform the UNHCR so that it can become truly able to help the Middle Eastern refugees to become happy, independent people. We thank the UN for hearing our solutions, and we hope you will accept them to create a more peaceful, just, and happy world.